At first, the marriage still looked ordinary from the outside. There was a house with familiar creaks, a couch worn soft at the edges, anniversary glasses drying by the sink, and the quiet confidence of a woman who believed she had finally arrived at forever. She had loved him in the plain American way people build a life together. Groceries on Sunday, folded laundry on the bed. Shared passwords, shared jokes, shared plans for a future that felt settled and safe. Then spring came, and something tiny began to tilt. He started refusing her more often when she reached for him at night. Not always with words, sometimes just with a sigh or a shoulder turning away. On the couch, he sat angled from her, as if even his body had already begun leaving before his suitcase ever would. None of it was dramatic enough to name. It was only a collection of little absences, and little absences are what make a home feel haunted first. She told herself not to be suspicious. Stress was everywhere that year, pressing on marriages, paychecks, routines. Inside their house, she kept explaining away each uneasy silence. A distracted husband could still be faithful, she thought. A tired man could still come back to himself. She brushed off each warning because the alternative was too sharp to hold. That love might be rotting in the room while she kept setting the table for one more ordinary night. What hurt later was not just that another woman existed. It was that the other woman was already inside their life. A friend. A woman who had sat in her house, sent kind messages, checked in with gentle words, played the role of someone safe. Looking back, every memory of that friendliness became a second betrayal. Some people do not break in. They are invited close first, then steal what matters, while everyone is still calling them harmless enough. By then, she had become the kind of wife who studied tiny movements without admitting it. How long he took to answer a text. How quickly he turned his phone face down. How often he laughed at nothing she had said. She hated how suspicious she felt, but intuition is often just memory arriving early. Her body was learning the truth before her mind would name it, and every room in the house seemed to sense that tension before she did, before morning came. Even so, she clung to the evidence of their happier days. Only weeks before everything shattered, they had celebrated like people still in love. Anniversary wine. A Valentine's week that felt warm and full of promise. That was what made betrayal feel unreal. Affairs are easier to understand when a marriage has already turned to ash. Harder when the photos still look bright, the table still carries two laughing bodies, and the vows are barely old enough to gather dust. The night the truth surfaced did not begin like a movie. There was no storm outside, no dramatic music, no instinctive certainty. Just darkness, shared sheets, the bluish flicker of a phone, and a woman rolling over because something in the silence felt wrong. Sometimes a life ends not with a slammed door, but with a glow on a screen. A doorway so small you almost miss it until you realize you have stepped through, and nothing behind you still belongs to you. On that screen was intimacy stripped of disguise. The woman on the other side wished she could be there to hold him. He answered with something crueler than cheating itself. He mocked his wife for trying to be close the night before. In a few cold lines, tenderness became comedy, marriage became nuisance, and the woman beside him became the punchline. Humiliation hit so fast, it numbed before it burned. It was a clean fracture, splitting her life straight down the middle. She confronted him with the phone still warm from his hand, and the confession came faster than mercy. He admitted it. No long denials. No scramble to protect what he had done. He blamed the pressure of that season, as if loneliness were weather and cheating were simply something that happened under it. But excuses sound thin when they stand beside evidence. What stood in front of her was not confusion. It was choice, repeated enough times to become its own second life. Then came the sentence that hollowed out whatever was left. He did not want to repair the marriage. He did not want counseling, repair, or the slow, ugly labor of trying to face what he had done. In his heart, he said, she was no longer his wife in the way that mattered. It was astonishing how calmly a person could torch a future and stand in the glow as if they were merely announcing a change of plans. Some heartbreak is loud. This kind arrived cold, neat, almost administrative in its cruelty. The story widened when she told the other woman's husband. That was how she learned the betrayal had roots stretching further back than the messages on the screen. Months earlier, there had already been a kiss. Suddenly, the timeline rearranged itself into something darker. Memories she had treasured became evidence she had misunderstood. The past did not disappear. It curdled. Every sweet moment now carried the aftertaste of concealment, as if joy itself had been used as camouflage. She kept circling one impossible thought. The week before that first crossing of the line, they had still looked happy. Not pretending to be happy, but genuinely lit from within. That was what left her drowning. Betrayal had not entered through a marriage already broken open. It had bloomed in the middle of the good part. She was not grieving a long decline she had ignored. She was grieving the discovery that even joy can be used as cover by the person standing closest to your heart. They had been married only about a year, which made the damage feel smaller on paper and larger in the soul. A short marriage can look minor to outsiders. To the person inside it, it is still a house built with hope, still a future arranged room by room, still a name spoken with devotion until it becomes part of your own. He had not just betrayed a relationship. He had taken a fresh promise, wrung from it all the innocence it still had left, and walked away from the wreckage. After that, the house changed shape around her. Every doorway held a memory. The kitchen where they ate, standing up on rushed weeknights. The couch where she had once fallen asleep against him. The bedroom where she replayed the moment she saw that screen until dawn turned walls pale and mean. She did not want to leave, but staying felt like pressing a bruise over and over to prove it still hurt. Home had become a museum curated by someone who no longer existed, and she was trapped inside it. As if betrayal were not enough, her life outside the marriage had also gone unsteady. She had been laid off, which meant too many empty hours and nowhere for her thoughts to go but backward. Unemployment makes grief louder because there is no schedule to interrupt it. She could examine every odd glance, every changed habit, every failed attempt to hold on, until memory itself became punishment. When pain has no clock, the mind works overtime trying to solve a mystery the body already survived. She began asking the kinds of questions that never lead to peace. Which nights had he lied? Which smiles had been borrowed? At what point had she become pathetic in her own eyes for still reaching toward a man who had already moved his loyalty elsewhere? Betrayal is a thief, but it is also a ventriloquist. It can make a wounded person speak in the voice of shame and call that honesty. The affair did not only break trust, it tried to recruit her into destroying her own dignity from the inside. Still, in the middle of the wreckage, she did one practical thing that mattered. She made a therapy appointment. On paper, it was small, just a date on a calendar, but it carried the first hint of movement. Not toward him, not toward saving the marriage, but toward saving herself from disappearing inside the story he had created. When people talk about rescue, they imagine drama. Often it begins as paperwork, a phone call, a session booked in trembling faith that someone might help you breathe. The days after discovery moved with a strange underwater slowness. She could still see him in the house, still hear cabinet doors and running water, and yet everything about him felt uncanny. The man she had loved seemed replaced by a colder duplicate wearing his face. He talked, but there was no warmth behind it. He moved through rooms, but not with any tenderness toward the life they had built. It was like living beside a stranger who knew every shortcut to her heart. What shocked her almost as much as the affair was his refusal to carry its moral weight. He tried to suggest that things between them had already been off, as though his deceit had simply drifted into a gap. But she could trace the sequence now. The relationship changed after the affair began, not before. He was not responding to damage. He was causing it, then pointing at the smoke as proof the fire had always been there. That kind of blame leaves its own scar. There is a special loneliness in realizing you cannot fight for a marriage by yourself. She might have endured counseling, hard truths, awkward rebuilding, months of grief, if there had been even a sliver of mutual effort. But he had already chosen indifference, and indifference is harder to argue with than anger. His detachment made her understand that the man before her was protecting his escape, not mourning the loss. Some endings are brutal because only one person is still arriving to them. Friends and strangers alike told her the same hard truth. Stop trying to decode him and start protecting yourself. Get legal advice. Lean on the people who show up. Fill the hours before the hours. Fill themselves with panic. At first, that guidance felt impossibly practical for a wound this personal. But grief needs structure, the way broken bones need a splint. Survival is not glamorous. It is lists, consultations, meals without appetite, texts answered when you want to vanish. So she started doing what devastated people rarely feel ready to do. She handled details. She spoke to professionals. She learned what separation looks like when romance has burned out and paperwork remains. Each task felt insulting in its normalcy. Sign here. Gather this. Decide that. Yet the bluntness of those steps helped. Betrayal had made life surreal. Administration, strangely enough, returned a little gravity to the ground beneath her feet and reminded her she could still move forward. The first therapy session did not erase anything. It did not make her peaceful or instantly healed. What it did was interrupt the cycle of self-interrogation long enough for another voice to enter the room. Not his, not the other woman's, not the accusing one in her own head. A steadier voice, one that could name gaslighting for what it was, and remind her that being betrayed did not mean being deficient. She needed someone to place the blame back where it belonged. Little by little, she stopped treating his choices like a referendum on her worth. That shift did not come in one brave morning. It came through repetition, therapy, honest friends, long exhausted evenings when she chose not to reopen old messages. She kept hearing the same truth until it finally settled. He had many options before deceit: honesty, distance, hard conversations, ending the marriage cleanly. He chose betrayal. That choice belonged to him, and it did not describe her. There were still terrible days. Days when humiliation felt fresh again, when she imagined that friend in her house and wanted to tear every memory from the walls. Days when she stared at the ceiling and wondered why being unwanted by one person could make the whole world feel dimmer. Healing is not linear because memory is not polite. It returns uninvited, tracking mud through rooms you had finally managed to clean, then leaving you to wonder why the floor suddenly looks ruined again. But alongside the grief came something quieter, anger with direction. Not the kind that burns everything down, but a more disciplined fury that asks what kind of life can still be built from the ruins. She began to notice how small she had become while loving him, how often she had edited herself to keep the peace, how much energy had gone into managing his moods and comforts. Betrayal had exposed the affair, yes, but it was also revealing a life where her joy had been rationed too easily. Once she could see that the old house looked different. Less like sacred ground, more like a place where too much of her spirit had gone dim. It was dreary in a way she had never fully admitted, full of compromises that no longer felt noble. She started imagining somewhere smaller, brighter, easier to move through. A place with walkable streets, good food nearby, and rooms that answered to her taste. Imagination became rehearsal for escape, and escape slowly began to look like something. Leaving was not one triumphant moment. It was a series of practical choices threaded with grief. Apartment listings, budget calculations, measurements for furniture that would belong only to her. Real reinvention often hides inside boring decisions made consistently. She kept going anyway. There was power in planning life that did not require his approval, in choosing a zip code, a lease, a neighborhood rhythm. She was no longer waiting to be chosen. She was choosing a future she could inhabit. When the move finally came, it felt less like running and more like re-entering her own body. The new city was smaller, walkable, alive in a way that made loneliness feel breathable instead of sealed shut. Brick sidewalks, local restaurants, windows lit warm at dusk, the low buzz of people moving with purpose. She could feel herself loosening just by existing there. Geography cannot cure heartbreak, but sometimes it gives grief enough air to stop choking you long enough to hear yourself again. Her new apartment became proof that preference is a form of recovery. She decorated without negotiating. Soft textures, feminine details, colors he would have dismissed. Corners arranged for comfort instead of compromise. It amazed her how emotional it felt to choose a lamp, a blanket, a set of dishes. And no one would make her feel frivolous for wanting beauty in her own home. Sometimes freedom is not dramatic. Sometimes it looks like a room finally reflecting your taste without apology. She began to understand another truth she had missed inside the marriage. She had been carrying more than anyone admitted. She was the breadwinner, the one bringing in stability, yet she had often been made to feel excessive for wanting pleasure from the life her work helped fund. Nice meals, fun outings, small luxuries. In the quiet after divorce, she could finally see how guilt had been used to keep her from enjoying what she had earned. Money had not been the issue. Permission had. So she started saying yes to herself. To restaurants she had wanted to try. To weekends built around curiosity instead of emotional management. To bakeries, wine bars, and tiny neighborhood spots that looked inviting from the sidewalk. Every simple pleasure seemed to return a piece of her to herself. Eating well, lingering somewhere cozy, spending money without apology. These became less about indulgence and more about relearning that her happiness did not need a defense attorney beside it. Therapy deepened as her environment changed. Once she was no longer surviving in the place where the betrayal had happened, she could hear herself more clearly. Sessions stopped feeling like emergency triage. They became a way to map the beliefs the affair had lit up, that she was easy to leave, easy to replace, always one step from abandonment. Together, they challenged those old stories. What happened to her was devastating. It did not have to become the definition of who she was. And then one morning she woke up and noticed something had shifted. The familiar pressure on her chest, that heavy animal of dread that used to greet her before she even opened her eyes, had loosened its grip. The grief was not gone, but it was no longer the first thing in the room. Light touched the apartment differently. Coffee tasted like coffee again. She realized she was curious about the day ahead, and curiosity after heartbreak can feel almost holy. That holiday season, she expected the emptiness to flare. Instead, she found relief. She spent time with family without negotiating schedules, moods, or obligations designed to keep someone else comfortable. There was no silent tension under the wrapping paper, no performance of togetherness for appearance's sake. Just room to be present. It startled her how peaceful that felt. She had once believed marriage automatically meant being less alone during the holidays. It did not. Meanwhile, she heard through other people that he cried about ruining his own life. The information floated back like gossip from a town she no longer lived in. Strangely, it did not move her. Regret performed for an audience is not the same as remorse offered to the person harmed. He had never given her the apology or reckoning she once thought she needed. In time, that absence stopped feeling unfinished. Silence from him had become one more fact she no longer needed to argue with. She also knew he was still seeing the other woman, and for a while that fact had felt like a knife kept warm just for her. Later, it became more like weather in another state. Real, unpleasant, but no longer determining what she wore, where she walked, or how she slept. Let them have each other, she began to think. Not from saintliness, but from release. Some people deserve the lives they build together, especially when those lives begin in the same carelessness that first brought them together. Eventually, she tested the idea of dating again. Not because she was desperate to be claimed, but because curiosity had returned. The apps, of course, were full of mixed signals and forgettable evenings. Men with polished profiles and no depth. Men who talked as if listening were decorative. Mediocre dates stacked up like proof that loneliness and freedom can coexist for a while. Oddly, that did not discourage her. Each bad date taught her something useful about standards, timing, and self-trust. Then came someone different, not a thunderclap, not an instant rescue, but a steadier kind of spark. He made her feel appreciated in ways that were almost disorienting at first. Desired without being consumed. Seen without being studied for weaknesses. There was no rush to turn possibility into certainty. They moved slowly, which suited her. After betrayal, speed can feel suspicious. Gentle pacing, by contrast, can feel like respect, and respect felt new enough to notice immediately. Dating did something unexpected. It reminded her she was lovable. Not in the shallow sense of being chosen for a night, but in the grounding realization that her warmth, wit, ambition, and presence had never disappeared just because one man failed to honor them. Betrayal can distort the mirror until you think you are seeing yourself clearly when you are only seeing damage. New connection, entered carefully, helped correct the angle. She was not hard to love. She had simply been loved badly. By then, the narrative she carried about the divorce had changed. In the beginning, it felt like personal failure. A future she should have prevented if she had been prettier, smarter, less needy, more anything. Later, through distance and work, that story lost its authority. The marriage ended because he broke faith and would not repair what he broke. That was not her failure. That was his. Naming that clearly did not make her bitter. It made her accurate, and accuracy felt like freedom. She looked around her life and saw evidence everywhere that she had not been left with nothing. A cozy apartment arranged to her taste. A city she adored. Work that engaged her. Family she could enjoy more honestly now. Therapy that had widened her understanding of herself. Even solitude had changed flavor. It was no longer the silence of being abandoned in the dark. It was the calm of a room she could fill with open windows, soft blankets, and thoughts that no longer had to defend themselves. There were moments when she remembered the desperate version of herself from those first weeks, the woman who wanted him to come home, who thought reunion might somehow restore her dignity. She did not despise that earlier self. She understood her. Grief bargains because love once did. But looking back, she could hardly believe how much energy she had spent trying to reopen a door that had protected nothing. The life she had built since made that old desperation look less shameful than human. What astonished her most was not that she survived. It was that surviving created room for joy more specific than the joy she had before. This happiness was not naive. It knew what deceit sounds like when it clears its throat. It knew how quickly charm can curdle into indifference. It knew the cost of ignoring intuition. And because it knew all that, it was sturdier. She could trust herself now in a way the marriage had never taught her to. Betrayal had taken innocence, but returned discernment. The city itself became part of her recovery story. Morning walks past storefronts, preparing to open. Evenings lit by restaurant windows, and the hum of people nearby. The relief of stepping outside instead of pacing grief between familiar walls. A walkable place gave her heartbreak somewhere to go. Motion helped. So did anonymity. In this neighborhood, she was not the betrayed wife at the center of an imploding marriage. She was simply a woman buying coffee, crossing streets, beginning again. She also found pride where shame used to sit. Pride in making the appointment when she could barely think. Pride in leaving when staying would have kept reopening the wound. Pride in furnishing a life without waiting for permission. Pride in moving slowly with new love, instead of rushing to prove she was healed. One day she realized she agreed with her therapist. She was proud of herself. After months of being reduced to someone cheated on, that feeling restored authorship to her life. The affair had once made her feel chosen against, as if another woman's presence had exposed some hidden lack in her. Time revealed something far less flattering for the people who betrayed her, and far kinder toward herself. Their choices reflected appetite, cowardice, secrecy, and self-interest. They did not reveal some final truth about her worth. Once she understood that, comparison began to loosen its grip.
Excuse me,
Integrity was never a contest, won by whoever lied most convincingly. Even now, anger visited sometimes. Recovery did not delete the insult of what had happened. There were still flashes of heat when she remembered the messages, the mockery. The friend who had smiled at her while helping dismantle the marriage. But anger no longer ran the household. It came through, spoke loudly, then moved on. That was progress too. Not becoming so serene that betrayal seemed acceptable, but becoming grounded enough that rage did not get permanent residency in the body. In private, she considered how close she had come to mistaking endurance for destiny. If he had wanted to return, if he had offered even a sloppy apology, would she have accepted less than she deserved just to avoid the humiliation of ending? The question kept her humble and alert. It reminded her that heartbreak does not automatically make people wise. Wisdom often arrives afterward. Once pain can be examined without the wish to reverse it. That clarity felt hard-won and worth protecting. By the time she said she was happy, she meant something richer than relief. She meant that mornings felt possible. She meant that her apartment looked like a woman had finally come home to herself. She meant that good food tasted better without guilt. She meant that family gatherings no longer required compromise with a man who had withdrawn his loyalty. She meant that dating had shown her standards, not desperation. Happiness, in this new form, was self-respect made visible in daily life. If someone had met her only at the beginning, they would have remembered a woman saying she felt like she was drowning. That image remained true. But drowning is not always the end of the story. Sometimes it is simply the body's language for a world collapsing too fast to name. She learned, breath by breath, that survival after betrayal is less about forgetting the water than discovering your own strength inside it. Eventually, you realize the shore has been getting closer the whole time. What she built afterward was not a consolation prize for losing her marriage. It was a real life, vivid and chosen, with its own texture and promise. The dream apartment was not a placeholder. The city was not a distraction. Therapy was not a temporary crutch. New affection was not revenge. These were the architecture of a future assembled by a woman who had finally stopped asking to be taken back into a burning house. She was not rebuilding the old life. She was building a better one. And that may be the most unsettling thing for betrayal itself. It does not always get the final word. It can wound, humiliate, disorient, and fracture the story someone thought they were living. But if the person who was hurt keeps choosing herself in the aftermath through therapy, movement, honest friends, brave, practical decisions, tiny joys reclaimed one by one. Then betrayal becomes chapter, not identity. It remains part of the history, yes, but not the horizon ahead. So this is not a story about a husband who strayed and a wife who was discarded. Not anymore. It is a story about a woman who discovered that the life she begged to save was too small for the person she was becoming. A woman who learned that being left by someone dishonest is not the same as being unworthy. A woman who turned a screenlit midnight into the first step toward daylight. The marriage ended. The humiliation passed. The grief changed shape. And she became entirely her own.